Have you ever felt like you lost something you could never get back? Like a mistake, one that wasn't even yours, had completely redefined your life? Some people carry a fall in their bodies, others in their souls. And sometimes, the worst part isn't falling. It's getting used to living in Lodabar, a place where dreams die, hope goes silent, and identity hides behind shame. This story isn't just about a forgotten character from the Bible. It's about me, about you, about anyone who's ever been ripped from where they belonged and thrown into a desert of anonymity. It's about a boy born a prince who ended up crippled and exiled. A man who thought his name no longer mattered until grace knocked on his door. Literally. If you've ever felt like no one remembers your pain, like the mistakes of the past have erased who you are, then stay with me. Because this story will show you that there is a covenant stronger than your fall. That there is a king who has not forgotten. And that there is still a seat at the table with your name on it. Mephibosheth was born with a promising future. Son of Jonathan and grandson of King Saul, he was part of Israel's royal lineage. From childhood, he was surrounded by symbols of power, honor, and legacy. His name carried weight, his inheritance was noble, and his early years were filled with promises of leadership and continuity. But royalty doesn't shield anyone from the winds of war. The same throne that affirmed his identity was also unstable, torn between Saul and David. And like many children caught in turmoil, Mephibosheth had no say. He grew up in the shadows of secret alliances and political tension he was too young to understand. Now picture the contrast: growing up in a palace with access to everything and suddenly watching it all vanish in an instant. His life changed drastically when chaos broke loose. The deaths of Saul and Jonathan changed not just the nation's fate, but that of a little boy. Childhood lost its light and took on the shape of pain. The same child who once roamed palace halls became just another fleeing orphan. No riches can ease the trauma of losing both a father and a grandfather in one stroke. And for Mephibosheth, that pain ran deep. People often don't grasp the pain of living with unfulfilled promises. Mephibosheth was born a prince, but no one saw that anymore. Grief came wrapped in fear and the urgency to survive. And in that desperate escape, something inside a child breaks. The royal boy faded into a forgotten footnote in Israel's story. But God never forgets those who were sidelined by circumstance. Some are born in palaces and thrown into the dirt before they even learn to speak. Mephibosheth's pain wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, deeply personal. As if the world had said, "You're no longer who you used to be." Maybe you felt that way. Like something took you off track, like an accident disconnected you from your purpose. Sometimes the pain begins so early that we forget what life felt like before it. And what's most heartbreaking, Mephibosheth didn't fall because of something he did. Just like many children raised in broken homes, in war zones, in abandonment, he simply inherited the ruins of someone else's choices. Not every fall is because of sin or failure. Sometimes life is just brutal. And even then, right in the middle of the chaos, God is already preparing the way back. That broken childhood would become the stage for a story of grace and redemption. What seemed like the end of a royal line was actually the beginning of divine reversal. Pain didn't erase the promise. Abandonment didn't cancel the covenant. Mephibosheth's story reminds us that even when all seems lost, heaven is still watching. But to understand the turning point, we need to go back to the moment of the fall. At just 5 years old, Mephibosheth barely understood the world, and it suddenly collapsed. The news of his father's and grandfather's deaths sent shockwaves. His nurse, panicking to save him, picked him up and ran. But during the escape, she stumbled. And in that stumble, fate was rewritten. The boy fell and never stood again. The fall wasn't just physical. It shattered a future, injured his body, scarred his identity. Imagine that a child, once destined for a throne, now crippled. A royal heir reduced to someone who must be carried. Once respected, now pitted. It was a brutal shift. He didn't fall because of poor decisions or recklessness. It was life in a split second. And sometimes, that's how our deepest wounds begin, with one unexpected moment. Mephibosheth lost the ability to walk, but more than that, he lost the right to see himself as worthy. In that society, disabilities weren't met with compassion. A cripple was seen as useless, as a burden. How many of us carry labels for limitations we never chose? How many live with the pain inflicted by others? If a fall isn't healed, it becomes a full stop in a story that was meant to continue. And the cruelest part? He was just a child. When we're young, we absorb everything as truth. If someone says you're worthless, you believe it. If they tell you your value is gone, you internalize it. Mephibosheth's fall became a broken mirror, and that's how he saw himself. No longer the grandson of a king, but a burden. A mistake that left a permanent scar. Have you ever felt like your own story held you back? Like your fall robbed you of the courage to try again? Mephibosheth didn't just lose his legs, he lost his sense of self. Shame became his companion. And when shame settles in, it starts speaking for you. It says you're not worthy anymore. And the worst part? You believe it. But hey race, the good news, no fall is deep enough to outrun grace. And this is where we begin to understand something powerful. What the world calls the end, God calls a turning point. The boy who fell and vanished from history was still on heaven's radar. And even if he couldn't walk anymore, one day he would be carried by the promise. But first, he had to endure exile and learn to survive in a place called Lodabar. Lodabar. The name says it all, a place with no pasture, no word, no hope. That's where Mephibosheth ended up after the fall. A forgotten village, far from royal halls, far from the memory of who he used to be. Imagine trading the sounds of palace music for the dry silence of emotional wilderness. Lodabar isn't just a physical place, it's a state of the soul. Anyone who's been there knows it's a place where you survive, but you don't live. Where the routine buries your dreams, and the past feels more alive than the present. That's where Mephibosheth grew up, in the house of Machir. It was a place of shelter, yes, but not of purpose. He was provided for, but not recognized. Fed, but never celebrated. He had just enough to avoid dying, but never enough to truly live. And maybe that's your reality too. You're alive, but not connected to your calling. You're breathing, but your heart's asleep. Lodabar is where the soul learns to live half awake. And when you stay too long in Lodabar, you forget what a table feels like. You forget the weight of your own name. Pain numbs your senses, and trauma starts shaping your identity. Mephibosheth, the prince, became that crippled guy. What once was a mark of royalty turned into a label of pain. That's what Lodabar does. It doesn't call you by your destiny but by your wound. And the sad truth? Many people settle for that. Shame becomes part of their outfit, something they wear without question. How many people are living like Mephibosheth without even realizing it? They feel like they have no value. Like whatever they once dreamed of was left behind. And worse, they believe God has forgotten them too. But God never forgets a promise. The covenant made with Jonathan still echoed in King David's heart. Even if Mephibosheth didn't know it, his story wasn't over. That's why Lodabar, no matter how dry it feels, is never the final chapter. You might be in Lodabar today, but that doesn't mean you'll die there. Places of exile can also be places of preparation. Sometimes God keeps us hidden for a season, not as punishment, but as protection. He's working behind the scenes. The exile doesn't cancel the promise. It prepares the heart to receive it again with maturity and gratitude. The silence of Lodabar may just be a rehearsal for a brand new beginning. And it's in that very silence that something starts to stir in the palace. David, now king of Israel, remembers the covenant he made with Jonathan. He sends for someone he's not even sure is still alive. While Mephibosheth lives in oblivion, God orchestrates a reunion. A new chapter is coming. Because when grace decides to move, not even the longest exile can stop it. But before that happens, the promise must be reactivated. Years had passed since the fall. Mephibosheth had likely grown used to the dust of Lodabar and the echo of his own thoughts. Then one day, out of nowhere, the silence is broken by the arrival of the king's soldiers. Imagine the fear. When you've lived as an exile, any summons from the palace feels like a threat. Why would the king want anything with me? He must thought. That's when fear speaks louder than hope. To him, it made no sense that royalty would care about a forgotten cripple. But there was something Mephibosheth didn't know behind that royal call was not revenge but covenant. David remembered his promise to Jonathan to preserve his lineage. That conversation, made long ago in the midst of war, was now coming alive. That's how God works. Time may pass. Circumstances may shift. But what God chooses to honor, He will honor. So the king, true to his covenant, sends for the last living descendant of his friend. Not because of merit, not because of status, but because of faithfulness to grace. Now think with me, what would it feel like to be summoned into the presence of someone who once represented danger? Mephibosheth, like many of us, expected judgment. He was ready for punishment. But when grace enters the story, it breaks every expectation. And that's something we need to understand. Your past doesn't disqualify you from grace. On the contrary, it sets the perfect stage for grace to show up. Grace doesn't come for the strong. It finds the broken. And here's the beautiful part: David doesn't hesitate. He asks, "Is there still anyone left from Saul's house, to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" It wasn't about worthiness. It was about love. About covenant memory. Mephibosheth was summoned because of a promise he didn't even make. And that points us straight to the gospel. We're invited to the king's table not because of who we are, but because of who loved us first. Jesus is the true David who remembers an eternal covenant and comes to rescue us. When Mephibosheth stands before the king, he bows and says, "What is your servant, that you should notice a dead dog like me?" That response reveals how deeply the fall and exile had shaped his self-image. He no longer saw himself as a son but as a reject. Yet he was still sought after. That's incredibly powerful, because there are people who've already given up on their own names. But God calls us by name. He knows us beyond our shame, beyond our scars. He sees promise where the world sees ruin. That reunion changes everything, because grace doesn't just seek us, it also repositions us. David not only spares Mephibosheth, but begins a process of restoration. The one who thought he'd be condemned is now received with honor. The palace that once seemed impossibly distant becomes, again, a place of belonging. And that's just the beginning. The next step isn't just forgiveness, it's a shocking act of mercy. As if being summoned to the palace weren't shocking enough, Mephibosheth is met with something unimaginable. David doesn't just spare him, he restores him. Even more than that, the king gives back all the land that once belonged to Saul, his grandfather, and commands Ziba, Saul's former servant, to now serve Mephibosheth. But the most impactful moment isn't about inheritance. It's the invitation. David says, "He will always eat at my table." This isn't just kindness, it's adoption. It's the king saying, "You belong here, like one of my sons." The king's table wasn't a place for the crippled. It was a place of honor, of strategy, of royal decision-making. But David breaks protocol. He doesn't see Mephibosheth's legs, he sees his identity. That's what grace does. It doesn't ignore our wounds, but it doesn't define us by them either. It sees us as whole, even when we feel broken. More than that, it includes us. You won't be left in the basement or on the margins, you'll sit at the table. That's mercy, pure and powerful. Think about it, Mephibosheth didn't ask for any of this. He simply came. He didn't argue, he didn't beg. He just answered the call. And maybe that's the greatest lesson here: those who respond to grace discover a favor that can't be explained. Mercy always outruns logic. And if you've ever felt too unworthy to receive something good, maybe that's when God most wants to surprise you. David could have ignored the promise, moved on, buried the past. But he acted based on covenant, not convenience. And that teaches us a lot about how grace works. It's not reactive, it's intentional. It goes after us. It honors what the world sees as lost. And if an earthly king could act that way, imagine what the King of Kings can do for you. God's mercy is never late. It arrives at the right time, in the right way, and changes everything. The image of Mephibosheth crippled, yet seated at the king's table every day, is one of the most beautiful metaphors in the Bible. Because there, in the king's presence, his legs didn't matter. No one saw his limitations. Everyone saw his position. And that's what grace does: it covers our shame with honor. Not because we deserve it, but because we were invited. Mercy doesn't clean us up so we can be loved. It loves us and that transforms us. And this is where many people get it wrong. They think they need to be healed before coming close. But Mephibosheth shows us the opposite. He was still broken when he was accepted. The table came before full restoration. That's grace. It's God calling us close even when we can't walk there on our own. Because His love doesn't depend on our performance, it depends on the faithfulness of the covenant. But there's more. Because this story carries a message that transcends time. The story of Mephibosheth isn't just an ancient tale about kings and princes. It's a mirror, a reflection of our journey with God, full of falls, exiles, and reunions. Many people live like he did, defined by something that happened long ago, still bleeding from wounds of the past, still letting old pain shape today's identity. But if this story shows us anything, it's that grace never forgets. Grace returns. Grace searches. And grace restores. It's so common to believe that only the strong, the perfect, the untouchable have a place in God's presence. But the Bible repeats it over and over. God leans toward the broken. He doesn't choose based on appearance or ability, He chooses based on purpose and heart. Mephibosheth was crippled, yes, but he was still heir to a covenant. And that's something no one could erase. The same is true for us. Even wounded, we still carry promises. Our names are still written on the heart of a king. And maybe the most powerful image of all, the table. A man marked by shame, sitting with the king every day. That is redemption in its purest form. The king's table is a place of communion, of restored identity, of belonging. To sit at the table is to hear you're part of this. And when we truly grasp that, fear fades. Shame goes silent. The past loses its grip. Because in the presence of grace, how you arrived doesn't matter, only that you were invited. Redemption is this: to be restored to a place that pain tried to steal from you. To remember that despite the fall, there's still a covenant. To realize that God doesn't just forgive, He repositions. And more than that, He honors. What was gray, He paints in color. What was silence, He turns into song. What was abandonment, He covers with presence. It's like heaven whispering, "You're still mine." It doesn't matter what they said. It doesn't matter what you lost. The king still calls you by name. So hey, race a challenge. Have you been living in Lodabar for too long? Is it time to rise, even limping, and answer the call of grace? God isn't waiting for you to be perfect. He's just waiting for you to come, to accept the invitation, to say yes to restoration. Because the table is set, the seat is saved, and your name is still on the list. All you have to do is show up. The rest? The king will take care of it. Mephibosheth's story ends with him living in Jerusalem, eating at the king's table every day. But the truth is that story continues. Because it happens all over again every time someone steps out of the exile of shame and returns to the house of grace. Every time a wounded heart surrenders to love that heals. This story is about him, but it's also about you. And maybe, just maybe, today is the day to say yes to that eternal invitation. So now, let me ask you, how many times have you believed that your fall had the final word? That because of your pain, you no longer deserved a fresh start? Maybe you've grown used to shame. Maybe you've even made Lodabar your home. But what if today is the day to take a step toward the table? What if the promise still stands even if you've forgotten it? What God did for Mephibosheth, He still does today. He searches for the forgotten, lifts the fallen, and turns emotionally crippled souls into honored sons and daughters. It doesn't matter how far you've fallen. What matters is who's calling you. And if the king is calling, why stay hidden? So reflect on this. What's been keeping you in exile? What voices still tell you you're not worthy? Today, I invite you to silence those lies and listen to one truth: you have a place at the table. Not because you earned it, but because of grace. Not by strength, but by covenant. If this message touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it too. And to keep receiving content that strengthens your faith, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's so much more coming, deep, powerful, and transformative. And you won't want to miss it.